evening and welcome to Shaw University's Black History Month panel, The Underground Railroad, Freedom Seeking in North Carolina. My name is Dr. Erin H. Moore, and I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Racial and Social Justice. And joining me this evening is Dr. Valerie Ann Johnson, the Dean of the School of Arts, Sciences, and Humanities. This event is being sponsored by the Center for Racial and Social Justice, as well as the School of Arts, Sciences, and Humanities, combined with generous support from the Duke Energy Foundation. We've selected to host this panel tonight in support of the North Carolina Opera's world premiere of Sanctuary Road, an opera that is based on abolitionist William Steele and his work for the Underground Railroad. Sanctuary Road will be at the Duke Energy Center of the Performing Arts March 4th through 6th, and we invite all of you to attend. And as Dean Johnson has said, before we begin, we'd like for you to mute your microphone. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. I'll be keeping track of those questions for at the end of the sessions for the panel. And we'll call on you individually for you to ask your questions and engage with our panelists. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dean Valerie Johnson, who will introduce our panelists for this evening. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you so much, Dr. Moore, for that great introduction and setting us up for what I know will be a wonderful panel. But before we get started with the panel, I do want to introduce Kimberly Gooden, who is with the North Carolina Opera. And if you will unmute yourself and say hello, and if there's anything we should especially know about NC Opera, now's your time to tell us about it.
Well, hello everyone, and I am thrilled to be here. And I'm especially thrilled to be partnering with the North Carolina Opera, partnering with Shaw University, as Shaw University will be really an integral part of the opera in that they will be hosting HBCU Night on Saturday, March 5th. So we're inviting all of you to come to this opera. It is a world premiere opera here in Raleigh. And as Dr. Moore stated, this is an opera that is based on the Underground Railroad, based on writings from William Steele. So it's going to be an exciting opera. We're looking forward to this partnership and also looking forward to many more opportunities with Shaw University in partnering in the fine arts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Gooden. As we get started tonight, I'm going to introduce to you two extraordinary historians, activists, and persons who are well-versed in African-American history. But what they're going to share with you today is really centered on the story in North Carolina. First, we have Miss Angela Thorpe. I know she has a thank you. Angela Thorpe's passion is sharing Black stories. She believes that Black people should be at the front lines of telling their own stories, and she works to create pathways and build connections to make that a reality. She is honored to do this work in a place where she has ancestral connections. Angela's family roots are tied to the small tobacco farming community of Pine Tops, North Carolina. Angela returned to her roots after receiving a BA in history with a minor in African American studies from the University of Florida. She pursued an MA in history with a concentration in museum studies from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. A longtime cultural heritage worker, Angela has worked in various capacities for the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources since 2015 and currently serves as the director of the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission. Angela has written on museum professionals, public history, and race for cultural heritage publications. She has also received awards for her commitment to the cultural heritage field from the American Alliance of Museums and the North Carolina Museums Council. Could go on, but I know that I need to have just this hour for you to share. Next is Earl, yes, claps. Next is Earl Ives, who has an incredibly interesting, varied resume. And I'm going to give you some of the highlights. At present, he is curator of the North Carolina Museum of History, but I also call him the artifact finder. Mr. Ives has used his knowledge of history, his interest in material culture, to find some incredible things and to uncover a variety of stories. He has served in the past as a reference archivist, a photograph archivist. Presently, he is a farmer in Johnston County. So when he tells you about farm history, he kind of knows it from the inside out. He also is owner manager of Town and Country Books and Coffee in Wendell, North Carolina. Among the things that he's done, he has served on and currently serves on Preservation North Carolina on the board. He has served with the Wake County Historic Preservation Commission, president and VP of Board of Directors, East Wake Academy in Zebulon. He has served as president of the East Wake Kiwanis Club. So these are some of the things that he's done outside of his history activities. But he's also helped us understand about the various important moments in our history, like serving on the North Carolina Civil War Sesquicentennial Committee. He served on the North Carolina World War I Centennial Committee, the North Carolina 1812 Bicentennial Committee. These committees are important because they touch us to our past, but you need someone who's rooted in the present to be able to do so. I am happy to have the pleasure of having both of these persons join us tonight to talk about freedom seeking in North Carolina. And at the end of their presentation, we'll tie it back to Sanctuary Road. So I will turn it over to Angela Thorpe, who will speak to us for a little bit. And then after Angela, we will have Earl. And once that's completed, we'll have a few questions and then we'll open it up to all y'all. Angela?
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dean Johnson, President Dillard, Dr. Moore. I am so delighted to be here. And really, I am so excited to just share with you all and do a little bit of storytelling. So give me a moment to pull up my presentation and we're gonna just chat and learn some. Okay. So today we are going to be taking a look at some of the ways that freedom seeking took shape in North Carolina, particularly during the Civil War era. And there's a couple of things that I'm hoping that y'all can take away in this 15 minutes that I have to share. One, that freedom seekers were real people, that freedom seekers were most often responsible for claiming their own liberation, that freedom seekers built communities and institutions and lives for their families, and that people claimed their freedom in North Carolina in a number of ways over time, by land, by sea, by river, individually, collectively, and that freedom seeking in our state is complex and messy and looks different for different people. And so again, I'm just going to take a little bit of time to share a couple of vignettes to illustrate the points that I've made. Again, we have 15 minutes, so we'll see how much ground that we can cover today. Okay. So the person that you see on this screen is an incredible gentleman named Captain Dempsey Hill. And Captain Hill was enslaved in Beaufort, North Carolina, so on our coast, and he took his freedom in 1861. At this time, the earliest parts of the Civil War were touching North Carolina's coast, and so Captain Hill would have been well aware of the fighting that was going on around him. And so as a result, he put a plan in place to take his freedom. One of the first things that he did to set that plan in motion was to go into a local customs house, take some nautical charts. He thought that those charts might be helpful to nearby Union troops. He took those charts and he buried them in a local cemetery. I'm going to walk you through what it looked like for Mr. Hill to take his freedom after he buried those nautical charts. I am reading an excerpt from an article written by historian David Siselsky about Captain Hill. On a pitch black night, Hill and 4 other enslaved watermen returned to the cemetery and retrieved the nautical charts. They then made their way to the waterfront a block south, being careful to avoid Confederate patrols. They stayed low and moved quickly down a wharf, commandeered a pilot boat, and set sail. They sailed under the guns of Fort Macon and out onto the inlet of the open sea. As the moon came up, they could see the masts of Union naval vessels, part of the North Atlantic blockading squadron. The 5 black men steered towards the closest Union ship. As they approached the ship, guns rolled out and a voice called out and demanded to know who they were, friend or foe. Dempsey Hill and his companions shouted over the dark waves, "We are 5 Africans seeking freedom." When they climbed aboard that ship, they were slaves no more. I should note that those nautical charts that I mentioned at the top of this story happened to be buried in a basket that contained champagne, and Mr. Hill and his comrades had a champagne toast before embarking on their journey to celebrate their freedom. Mr. Hill, or Captain Hill, went on to serve in the Navy aboard various vessels. He later relocated north and settled in Massachusetts, where he continued to make a living on the water. So again, this captain, this astute man who could navigate the waterways of North Carolina's coast, took his freedom by water. He went on to serve and fight for freedom in the U.S. Navy, which at the time was not 100%, did allow African Americans to serve. And again, he went on to make a life for himself in Massachusetts. I want to take us through another story of freedom seeking by water, of claiming liberation by water. And in this story, I want to reinforce that in North Carolina, Black people of all ages took charge of liberation for themselves. This story is documented in a 1936 WPA slave narrative of Alex Huggins, who at the time of claiming his freedom was a 12-year-old. Mr. Huggins, who was enslaved in Wilmington, describes his experience to the oral historian taking his freedom from New Bern in 1863. And again, at the time he was 12 years old and aware of the war that was going on around him. He told his interviewer that he wanted to give freedom a try and that he thought he would have to get away from home to have it. So he convinced 2 of his friends, 2 other children, and an adult to join him. The adult secured a boat for the party of freedom seekers, and this group went out to sea. Mr. Huggins felt a sense of adventure at first as they went on their journey, but this sense of adventure later turned to almost crippling fear for, again, this child. And he was so afraid that he got sick in that boat. These young boys and their adult companions were picked up by a mail steamer called the North Star, where they remained along the North Star's journey. Mr. Huggins, again, a kid, later joined the Navy, and he served in multiple capacities. He also went on to see battle, including in North Carolina, where he bore witness to the bombardment of Fort Fisher, again here in North Carolina. He recounts other experiences in his narrative, and he talks about discharging from the Navy when he had served 18 months. He lived in New York for about 5 years before returning to North Carolina. He went back home to Wilmington, and he ultimately made a living in the crude drug business. He married, he had a son, and he supported his mother and other family members with his pension that he received from his naval service, again, after claiming his freedom as a child. So again, these are two examples of one very young man and an older man taking their freedom, claiming their freedom for themselves by North Carolina's waterways. Speaking of water, I have kind of put up a map here for you all to look at, and I've outlined a couple places that you all might be familiar with. If you all are familiar with the Outer Banks in North Carolina, you can reframe the Outer Banks in your mind as some of the earliest places for freedom seekers to seek refuge in the state of North Carolina. Again, these are places where folks fled to claim freedom and start their lives anew. You'll see that I've identified two what I call freedmen's communities. Towards the bottom right of your screen, you'll see a Hatteras Island in a box. Towards the top of your screen or your middle of your screen, you'll see Roanoke Island in a box. Let's talk a little bit about what happened at each of those places. In 1861, as I mentioned earlier, the Civil War is hitting the coast of North Carolina, and one of those earliest places that was ultimately captured by Union troops was the Hatteras Island. It was captured in 1861 as a result of the Battle of Hatteras Inlet. And so enslaved people from coastal plantations crossed the Pamlico Sound to freedom. That first safe haven, or one of those earliest safe havens for African Americans on this island, was called Hotel de Afrique. Barracks that were on the island were later transformed into housing for Black freedom seekers, and hundreds of people lived on this island. And I will note that conditions here were incredibly hard. Something similar happened on Roanoke Island. In fact, in 1862, once that island was captured by Union troops, African Americans fled here. And Union troops established what they called a contraband camp on that island that was initially called Roanoke Island Contraband Camp. That camp was renamed Roanoke Island Freedmen's Colony in 1863. And by the tail end of the Civil War in 1865, this was one of the largest freedmen's communities in the state of North Carolina. The colony was organized into avenues and cross streets. Schools were built, sawmills, places where people could get health care, housing, and ultimately about 4,000 people lived here towards the end of the Civil War. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about how people claimed their freedom by water. I want to talk a little bit about some of the ways that folks claim their freedom by land. I also want to talk about why some people ran to freedom, why some people claimed their freedom. On your screen, you'll see what we call a runaway slave advertisement. This is a type of advertisement that I'm sure many people in the audience are familiar with. And this advertisement presents a really powerful example of not just freedom seeking, but again, why somebody might choose to risk everything to run to freedom. This ad is from July of 1862, and it was placed by a slaveholder in Wilmington, North Carolina. In this ad, we learn that two men are running towards liberation. One of those men is named Dick, and he is in his late 30s. He's about 38 or 39 years old. He is running with his companion, a 21-year-old man named Talton. We know from this ad that this is not Dick's first time trying to claim his freedom. In the past, he has secured forged freed papers. He names himself Dick Freeman, and he seeks to claim his freedom. Again, he's doing this as early as the 1850s. So again, people are responsible for claiming their own liberation, and people will do what they can to claim liberation over and over again. We think that in this instance, Dick probably got a hold of free papers again with his companion, Talton. And we know that Dick and Talton are running from Wilmington to New Bern, which is an incredible distance. And one of the reasons why, Dick has a wife and children in New Bern. He is running, in this case, to Union occupied territory, to free territory, to start his life anew with his wife and with his children. So you might say that Dick is running to love. And in a lot of cases of freedom seekers in North Carolina, people are running to love, to family, to children, again, to start their lives anew. This is one of the most powerful images that I have ever come across in my career. I want everyone to take a look at William Headley, Mr. William Headley, who was a freedom seeker from Raleigh. Take a look at his face. Take a look at his posture. Take a look at his stance. I want to tell you a little bit about his journey as we continue tonight to celebrate our state's liberation stories. I'll note that Mr. Headley's journey is documented on the back of this picture. It's actually written in script, and so that's how we know what his journey from Raleigh to New Bern was like. This picture was taken of Mr. Headley shortly, almost immediately after he arrived to New Bern, North Carolina in 1864. Mr. Headley traveled for 6 weeks by foot from Raleigh to New Bern. And according to the story that's on the back of this image, Mr. Headley had no shelter at all during his journey. So he was exposed to the elements nearly the entire time, and he would have left Raleigh in probably early April. We know that Mr. Headley journeyed with 2 others. So again, he was with 2 companions. He did not make this journey alone. However, his 2 companions were caught by slave catchers. And we know that Mr. Headley keeps going, but he tells the person documenting his story, he doesn't know whether his 2 companions were killed there on the spot, murdered, or whether they were taken back to Raleigh for punishment. Again, he kept going. He kept going to freedom. When Mr. Headley arrived in New Bern, he was described as weak and nearly famished. His clothes were described as of many colors and qualities. His cloak was made of an old cotton grain bag, slit open on one side and raveled, which gives the appearance of fringe. You can see that fringe in the image in front of you. Despite all of this, Mr. Headley is described as being happy. William Headley ran from Raleigh to New Bern for 6 weeks to freedom. He made it, and therefore he was happy, joyful, and grateful too, I might imagine. In our short time together, we have learned how people took their freedom by land and sea. We have learned who took their freedom: children, husbands, mothers, young men, sailors. We have learned what people did. Some people fought, others built communities, others just began again with their families. In this case, of what I've shared, these various means of resistance and freedom seeking were documented in firsthand accounts, in letters, and photographs, in government records. Projects like the Wake County Enslaved Persons Project, which of course is an initiative held by Shaw University, the Runaway Slave Advertisements database out of UNCG, which is based upon the work of Dr. Freddie Parker, historic newspapers, the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission's Freedom Roads Initiative, research by curators like Earl Ives and community historians like Sharon Bryant and Bernard George. All of these things will help us to continue to learn more about what liberation and freedom seeking look like in North Carolina. I'm not sure that we'll ever have a finite picture, but as long as we continue to collectively do the work, we will enable the picture to grow and grow. So thank you for your time today. I so look forward to hearing from Dr. Ives in just a moment and joining him in conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. And now we'll turn it to Earl Ives for his presentation, and then we can have a little conversation. Earl, you're on.
Thank you, Dean Johnson. Angela, another great presentation. Thank you for that. And thank you, Dr. Moore and President Dillard for hosting this conference. It is my pleasure to participate in this. And as I was sharing with Dean Johnson before our program, I have been waiting for a moment like this so that we could share some of our research. So without further ado, bear with me here, and I'm gonna share the title of my presentation and also share a little bit more onto what Angela shared with us in a little bit of a song. And as we know, the Underground Railroad was undergirded with singing and the rhymes of what I guess Marvin Gaye would call heard through the grapevine. And so one of those songs that were sang was, I'm gonna lay down my burden down by the riverside, down by the riverside. And so that was one of the songs that was chanted that directed people to these waterways and the pilots that were Angela mentioned in her presentation. And so what you see on the screen is an image from the State Archives original print collection showing freedom seekers going through the pine forest, which y'all know me, know I talk about the land of the lonely pine, and North Carolina is the home of the land of the lonely pine, which was predominant forest interspersed with forests of lonely pines and cypress and gum and so forth. So without further ado, I want to share the presentation, but before we get too far into it, I will be remiss if I did not tell you that the following information contains graphic languages and images. We're talking about slavery and the Underground Railroad, so viewer discretion is advised. And what you see on the screen is what happened to many freedom seekers if they were apprehended. This is an image from Harper's Weekly of the whipping stocks that were at Goldsboro, North Carolina, before the Civil War. And this image came from Harper's Weekly from the State Archives. North Carolina's river basins, North Carolina contains 17 river basins. Rivers, their tributaries, estuaries, and precosins were highways of the Underground Railroad. And a precosin, for those who don't know, if you look closely at that screen, you see the various river basins across the geography of not only North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, Tennessee. And those rivers stretch from the mountains to the sea, and they provide oasis spaces that before modern times were relatively inaccessible and even impenetrable. For our discussion, we're going to concentrate primarily on the right side of your screen, or the Piedmont, or what we call Eastern North Carolina. We had encamped so early that we found in the evening time to walk near half a mile into the woods. There, we came upon a family of mulattoes, a word for mixed race people. That called themselves free, though by the shyness of the master of the house, who took care of to keep least sight, their freedom seemed a little doubtful. It is certain many slaves shelter themselves in this obscure part of the world, nor will any of their righteous neighbors discover them. On the contrary, on account of selling such fugitives on some out-of-the-way corner of their land to raise stocks for an inconsiderable share, well knowing that their condition makes it necessary for them to submit to any treatment or to any terms. This is William Byrd and his publication of the Histories of the Dividing Line betwixt Virginia and North Carolina in 1728-29, when North Carolina was declared a royal colony and officially separated from South Carolina. And I'm glad that Angela hit the high points of the antebellum era, because many times the Underground Railroad takes the connotation of the antebellum era only, when it actually started with the very beginnings of slavery in the 1500s and the 1600s under Spanish and colonial rule. What you see on this 1740 map of North Carolina is X marks the spot of the Roanoke River Maroon community that William Byrd described in his 1728 publication that is today known as Lake Gaston, North Carolina. The area described in 1728 by William Byrd's Histories of the Dividing Line betwixt Virginia and North Carolina, as again, is the thriving resort community of Lake Gaston, located within the Roanoke River Basin along the North Carolina and Virginia line. The area was once impassable swamps and precocin and provided centuries of safe spaces for freedom seekers. The area remained a vibrant community until the United States Army Corps of Engineers dammed the Roanoke River, submerging that ancient community under the artificial lake in 1963. I've had some of my diver friends tell me that they have gone scuba diving in Carr Lake and have seen the houses and the cemeteries of this once maroon community. The Great Dismal Swamp on the Virginia-North Carolina border is the largest swamp in North America. Originally, it was 63,000 acres of swamp, and it was basically impenetrable. American Indians, and this is important to note, that with the introduction of colonialism, the indigenous people, as well as Africans who were enslaved, some indigenous people were also enslaved, retreated to the swamps to escape colonialism and slavery, thus creating maroon communities. Now, this is a 2009 view from the Great Dismal Swamp Canal that was dug by enslaved laborers who were chained together with oxen between 1792 and 1806. The laws in Virginia and North Carolina were passed requiring physical description of enslaved and free persons of color who were employed in the Dismal Swamp to dig this canal, just in case they sought freedom in the Great Dismal. Now, yours truly, and as Dr. Johnson mentioned, I have a habit of going off into these places and taking photographs of things like this, which was an image that I took some years ago. And I can only imagine the brutal torture. If you ever been to the Great Dismal Swamp in the summer, you're going to be attacked by flies, mosquitoes, ticks, snakes, alligators, bears, every imaginable creature, maybe even Bigfoot. But I cannot imagine, and every time I see this canal, how many bodies are underneath that canal. So when matching up that picture, I use this Harper's Weekly to find that similar location. The Dismal Swamp Canal was among America's first superhighways. Lumber and naval stores industries offered employment to freedom seekers with no questions asked. And again, this is a Harper's Weekly that shows workers in the Dismal Swamp Canal in the 19th century and at the supply store. The Great Dismal Swamp became a safe space for freedom seekers in Virginia and North Carolina from the 1600s to the 1800s. This is an image of General Tom Copper depicted, who was outlawed and sentenced to death for leading freedom seekers into the Great Dismal Swamp. A major conductor on the Underground Railroad, Copper sought freedom in the Dismal Swamp from slavery in northeastern North Carolina. Now, what's interesting is, at this time frame, there were many what I call patriots of color, people of mixed race, African Americans, who were formerly Revolutionary War patriots, who had literally been legislated out of existence by the 1792 Militia Act. And many of these former American Revolutionary veterans and heroes were literally being captured and re-enslaved. And so it makes one wonder when Tom Copper is being assigned the term general, if he was in fact a Revolutionary War veteran. But sometimes freedom seekers were armed for hunting and for hunting animals and for protection against animals and slave patrols. This is a grainy image of a newspaper article that I found many years ago that I've been able to abstract the following from that I'll share with you. We learned from Norfolk, Virginia, by the last mail that the people of the lower counties of North Carolina are much alarmed at the conduct of the Negroes. Several have been apprehended, tried, condemned, and instantly executed at the state, and that the state of the jail of Elizabeth City, North Carolina is full of Negroes, many of whom left expected will suffer death. An attempt was made to liberate some of those confined in that same jail some time ago by 6 stout black fellows, well mounted, that means well armed, 4 of whom were taken and the others escaped. It seems that they have had a camp regularly organized and that they have proper form, or in other words, they're trained like military men, compelling them in such articles. The commander-in-chief is one Tom Copper, who has been outlawed. The last Norfolk paper, which came out on hand yesterday, contains a list of names of blacks who have exposed themselves under General Copper, among which are Big Charles, Old London, Little Isaac, and so and so forth. But as the names of these are of consequences to the readers here, we shall take up the room of our concerns by revealing them. This was published in the Baltimore newspaper of the Democratic, Republican, and Commercial Daily Advertising, alerting the community along the entire East Coast from Maryland to Virginia and into North Carolina. The Underground Railroad fights back. What you see is a grainy letter from my research archives from Elizabeth City describing an insurrection led by one Tom Copper. Copper, who, as I mentioned, was tried and sentenced to death, where the trial was moved over to Camden County, the county next to Elizabeth City and Pasquotank County in North Carolina. But he was one of those freedom seekers who managed to escape that next day. And this was published in the Philadelphia newspaper, in the United States Oracle, as the United States Oracle, as well as the Portsmouth Advertiser as far north as New Hampshire on the 29th of May, 1802. Left is what you see is an article that I located in the criminal action papers of Chowan County, North Carolina, in the state archives, where a grand jury in Edenton, North Carolina, charged Michael, Wilder, and Jack with providing a group of freedom seekers arms and ammunition in exchange for stolen goods, once the property of the United States government being stored at the Chowan County Courthouse. And on the right, I had the privilege to lecture last year at that Chowan County Courthouse, built in 1767, which would have been just years before this advertisement was taken out. And this lecture I gave on freedmen schools in 1767. And I mentioned then that every time I go to that historic place, you can almost feel the spirits of those who were once enslaved there. Freedom seeking in North Carolina, 27-year-old Oliver sought freedom. Slaveholder Thomas B. Littlejohn advertised that the, quote, 5'8" black fellow will make his way to Newbern from Granville County, which was the largest slaveholding county in the state of North Carolina. Oliver, as he was called, likely travailed the estuaries and precautions of the Falls of the Neuse through Raleigh, down the Neuse River swamps around Smithfield and Kinston toward Newbern. Neuse was once a community located on the Granville and Wake County line for people of color as a haven until it was turned into what we people in the triangle call Falls Lake in 1981. And there is still a very small remnant of some of the descendants of some of those people who now live in what is called North Raleigh. If you have a look at the ad, it reads, ran away from the subscriber on the instant, a Negro fella named Oliver, tolerably stout built and well made, aged about 27 years, but looks young for that age, having very little beard, about 5 feet 8 inches high. He is tolerably black fellow with a very pleasing smile, countenance, is very polite and courteous in his manners, has a rather soft, effeminate voice, and has a short, quick step when he walks. He has for several years been employed as a waiter in the public house kept at this place and carried with him sundry articles of very good clothing which can not be described. He took off with him a dark and sorrel horse, at the time much sunburnt and in low order, about 4 feet 10 or 11 inches high, with a white face. That is the horse. And the horse has a scar under its right eye and is about 8 years old. I will give the above, requiring an above described Negro fella, ... who may enable me to regain the runaway without any cause whatever. I am apprehensive he has furnished with free papers and will make his way towards New Bern, North Carolina. Thomas B. Littlejohn, Oxford, Granville County, September 29th, 1814. Dr. Johnson, I got that especially for you.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
And you have about 3 minutes.
Okay. As we go through, more of that information is about a man and his wife, to Angela's point, and their 2 daughters run into love through that maroon community toward Johnston County in that area. The JC, as it's called today, was a county that was 2/3 originally swamp. What happens to those people who are caught on the Underground Railroad? A stout, likely young Negro, Andrew, who sought freedom from a slaveholder, Reddick Pender, in Halifax, North Carolina, along the Roanoke and Pamlico River, was headed toward Bath when he was apprehended by slave patrols and slave dogs. That's bloodhounds. They were trained to eat people in Pitt County, North Carolina. And this ad was placed above an ad that kind of quaintly advertised the sale of a very likely 13-year-old Negro girl. And here is an ad for one Andy, alias Billy James, who attempted to rob a store east of Raleigh on the Neuse River near modern-day Knightdale, North Carolina. The article notes that Andy had been charged with burglary previously to becoming the Maroon, but was released because his owner thought him too valuable. The place where Andy or Billy James robbed or was accused of robbing was Anderson Point Plantation of Governor Stone, located on the Neuse River in present-day Knightdale in Wake County. 1996 Hurricane Fran destroyed the remains of the plantation, but Governor Stone's Bertie County Hope Plantation is a state historic site in North Carolina today. So I said the Underground Railroad is undergirded with songs, and what you see on the screen is an excerpt from the Negro National Anthem. Have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed. We have come a long way, and we have treaded our path of the slaughter out of the gloomy past till now we stand. And we can sing it and go on, but you don't want to hear me sing unless you want your computers cracked. So without further ado, I'll let you read and we'll sing together maybe later the stanza of the Negro National Anthem. Essequam Rederi.
Thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you.
And now we're going to begin with just a few questions, and I'll start, and then I'll have Dean Johnson continue. And I think this question is for both of you, and I'm sure that people in the audience have noticed your use of language. You have terms like took his freedom, claimed his freedom, running towards liberation, freedom seekers. And it's very interesting, the power of language, because when we think of most things about enslaved persons, we see that the people who chose their freedom are called runaways, like they're running away from something, or they're rebels, or they're fugitives, or they're escapees. And I just wanted both of you to comment briefly on your choice of language and why you made these conscious choices to use the terms that you did. And Ms. Thorpe, we'll start with you.
Certainly. So one of the reasons that you hear me using the language that I do is quite frankly and simply for agency. As I stated at the top of my presentation, Black people are very often responsible for their own freedom. Oftentimes when we're, or sometimes when we're hearing stories about liberation, about emancipation, particularly in the period in which I was talking, white folks are centered, right? White Union troops, white generals. If you're familiar with the Juneteenth story, that often starts with General Gordon Granger, but that is not the case, right? Black people are responsible for running, for going to communities where they can be free and start their lives anew. So again, the language that I use is intended to center Black people and to really help folks understand the agency that Black people had in claiming their freedom. Earl?
Thank you, Angela. And just to dovetail into that, the narrative for 400 years in North Carolina and 200 plus years of American history has been from the perspective of the slaveholder, running away from slavery, and not the perspective of those enslaved, escaping slavery, seeking freedom, stealing yourself for your family. So we've had 200 plus years of America, 400 plus years in Carolina of being conditioned that people from Africa were slaves and not people. And I often say something in my lectures that our customs or our mores and folkways, customs follow the codes or the laws. And the laws of the very Constitution of the United States of America enshrined people who were enslaved as 3/5 human beings. And so it became customary to think of people from Africa as 3/5 or subhuman in an effort to justify the brutal treatment of slavery. So what we're doing, Angela and I and our team, we're changing that discussion and that narrative by turning that conversation on its head and having a more proper perspective and equal perspective and giving life to those formerly denied life and freedom.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I really hope that everybody who's on this panel really pays attention to that, because as you read books, when we talk about the history of African-American people, it's very important for us to use language that liberates us and centers us. And I just really want to thank both of you for doing that, because it's just so, it's just so, it shouldn't be jarring, but it's something that you notice right away, your use of language. Dean Johnson, I'm gonna let you take the next question.
Well, actually, my question is to both our panelists as well. Tell us where the sites are in North Carolina that you can go to learn some more about this history? I know there's some initiatives that help us understand it, and you can actually visit those. So tell us about those sites, and either one of you can start.
Sure, I'll start with a couple. I think part of what is so incredible about the history that Earl and I are sharing is, again, you can walk on the grounds where our ancestors walked and claimed their freedom. And so one of those places that was, you might consider it a hub for the Underground Railroad in our state, is Halifax, North Carolina. There is a state historic site there in Halifax. And Halifax had a pretty large community of free people of color, which made it a really great place, a stopover really for people who were enslaved trying to claim their freedom. And it's right there near the Virginia border as well. And there's a Roanoke River there as well. So again, that is a place where people could stop over, but also cross the Roanoke River as they continued on their freedom-seeking journey. Another place in our state is Greensboro, North Carolina. Guilford College actually has a beautiful space preserved, the Guilford College Woods, where you can take a walk along an Underground Railroad trail that they've created there, in part due to the proximity of the Quaker community in Greensboro. This was also a haven for freedom seekers in our state. So those are our two that I'll mention. Of course, as Earl stated, the Great Dismal Swamp. If y'all drive to Virginia, again, you're gonna probably drive through the Great Dismal Swamp, and there is a state park that's connected to that swamp. So that's another place where you can, again, walk upon those lands where our ancestors sought some of their freedom. Earl, where would you add? Oh, also, of course, as I stated, the Outer Banks. So literally Roanoke Island, Hatteras Island, still places where you can go. Of course, they've been kind of reframed as these resort towns, but Black heritage is all throughout those communities as well. Yeah, Earl, what would you add?
Well, thank you. That is right. And to dovetail about Halifax County, and one thing that I presented in my presentation at Historic Halifax, I would highly encourage you to go visit that state historic site. It is actually on the Roanoke River. There's a landing that goes down to the river, which was once the site of the old sawmill and the turpentine distillery, or the tar kiln, which, as I mentioned, is a no questions asked employment for people coming up and down the river. And it's good money too. We're not talking chump change. We're talking the largest industry in North Carolina. And so people could get paid, get fed, and keep it moving. And so you could go down to Halifax County, historic Halifax, but behind the actual building, in the building itself is a 1760s map that will show you where the sawmill is. And you can follow that down behind the historic site to the river and actually stand on that site and be in that space. But I also mentioned, if you noticed, some of these artificial lakes, like Falls Lake, like Carr Lake or Lake Gaston, Lake Jordan, south of Durham. These lakes are all artificial lakes that were once over swamp areas that were gathering oasis spaces, that were once primarily communities of color that were at one time completely inaccessible until modern engineering. And I mean modern engineering, things like railroads in the early 1900s. And so, and then highways in the 1950s and 60s. So these areas today can still be seen, sometimes without even getting out of your car. And a good example is, we mentioned New Bern. And New Bern was a haven, particularly during the Civil War. There was a community called James City that was named for a Union General, Horace James, because the freedom seekers, literally from as far as Georgia and South Carolina, followed the Union Army into North Carolina at that place. And so when you're traveling east from Raleigh along that trail that I mentioned, from Granville County, Falls of the Lake, down the Falls of the Neuse, through Smithfield and Johnston County, modern day Goldsboro, modern day Kinston, into New Bern. On that 70 highway bridge, when you're entering New Bern, there's a giant swamp area where the bridge crosses. That is James City. And that was a destination for many freedom seekers from Raleigh and from the Piedmont. And again, freedom seekers who literally followed Union General William Tecumseh Sherman's army in 1864 and 65, from as far as Atlanta and Chickamauga, Georgia, through Savannah, Columbia, South Carolina, Richmond County, North Carolina, Fayetteville, Goldsboro. These people literally by the thousands were freedom seekers. And you can see those trails where those people went at each one of those destinations that I just mentioned. But then lastly, if you're here in Raleigh or the local Triangle area, you can just simply go over. There's a place that's a Wake County Park, I think it's called Anderson Point, and is named for the plantation of Governor Stone. And it is just over, if you're familiar with New Bern Avenue and Raleigh, heading east, Highway 64, is right before you get to the bridge on the Neuse River. There is a sign that says Anderson Point Park. And you can literally go down there and see the remnants of the old plantation house that once stood there until Hurricane Fran washed it away in 1996. So for all you history geeks like Angela and me, put on your boots, put on your gloves. You might want to get some bug off, unless you go out there this time of the year, but it will be something that I think you would cherish and remember.
And this is where, when we talk about new scholarship and using other means, methodologies, underwater archaeology is just beginning to start excavating these places that interpret our history. So now the challenge is to go into these covered up areas, these places that were dammed up and then destroying communities, and find the remnants that interpret the rest of the story. So my encouragement to all is to think about underwater archaeology, and it does happen here in North Carolina, and there are internship students that you don't have to have taken a class. They will teach you what you need to know. I had to put in that plug because that is one of the things you can do that can set you apart. So I'm encouraging you to think about that.
Thank you so much, Dean Johnson. That's a great, great point. And we have great comments from the audience. So everyone is thanking you all so much for your comments. But I'm going to turn over to Dr. Tinsley. She has a very interesting question, and I'd like for her to unmute herself and ask the question, and provide a little more context of the question. And go ahead, Dr. Tinsley.
Okay, thank you. I was trying to frame it quickly as possible. I'm pretty sure you are familiar with the term drapetomania, where we are been pretty much as a people been told that slaves accepted their position, they were docile. So if you wanted to escape, then they gave you a name of a disease called drapetomania, meaning that wanting to be free was a disease, a mental illness. And so I was just speaking to that because it has been the conception that there weren't many insurrections. That was very small, but what you're speaking about today and what we know about our history is that we never accepted that. Never accepted that. So I just want to just make that point, and maybe you might have something else to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll add just a bit, and I think Earl can speak more specifically to larger insurrections, but I think the concept of resistance is incredibly important here, right? I see any form of resistance as a means towards freedom seeking, right? And Black folks resisted in all sorts of ways while they were enslaved, and even as they sought to escape from plantations while seeking their freedom. So again, any small level of resistance, again, in my opinion, counts as freedom seeking. I'll also note that what's important to understand to a point that Earl made earlier is the ways in which Black people are and are not documented, and the way that Black people show up in the archives, right? And when we're doing this work, it is incredibly important to interrogate what we are seeing and reading in the archival record. I have an example that I didn't get to share today. I did have it on my presentation, but I did not get to share it. It is a letter written by a white man, a white attorney in Washington, North Carolina, who has been called to a plantation to help figure out what to do with enslaved people on this particular plantation as the Civil War approaches. And part of what he writes in the letter is that there is a lot happening on that plantation. Enslaved people are burning items, burning buildings. Enslaved people are breaking into the main house and taking valuables. Enslaved people have seen the mistress, if you will, bury some of her valuables. So they're going behind her, they're taking them out of the ground and they're collecting them. And they have communicated to all of the white folks on the plantation that they're going to leave, right? They are headed to enemy lines. They're taking these valuables with them so that they can sell them for funds to make their lives anew. But if you read the letter and the way that this lawyer writes it, of course, it's not framed as resistance. It's framed as chaos. It's framed as these people are nuisances. He even says he will fight to move them away from the war, and he will take people dead or alive. That to me communicates the level that people were resisting, again, in this particular place in Washington, North Carolina. So again, this is an example of interrogating the archives, sort of interrogating the record, and recognizing that not every form of resistance was documented across our state.
That's a great point, Angela. And to further that point, and I want to follow up with you, Dr. Tinsley. You mentioned how the narrative or the history books make it slavery a docile acceptance for that. Enslaved people were docile and accepting of that condition. In my many years of the archives, I would say, to use modern terminology, they were fronting. They were putting on a front for white people of smiling and hemming and hawing, what we old timers call it, right? So that they would not raise guard to the slaveholders. And that would allay the fears and concerns while they whispered through the grapevine or sung, "I'm gonna lay down my burden down by the riverside." And that way, the folks sitting on the porch say, "Well, hey, doesn't that song sound so good?" So those types of resistance are almost unintelligible for slaveholders. And so when they make accounts in history, they cannot understand it and therefore cannot convey it. And so it takes our mind and culture these many centuries later to read through the lines and say, hey, well, you know, no one wants to be chained together with an ox in the Dismal swamp in 105-degree August heat humidity day, being beaten and eaten by snakes and alligators, but they're gonna smile and say, "Yes, sir, boss." And so the boss is gonna say, "Oh, they're some good ends," you know? And so they're gonna write that in their memoirs. And so my experience as an archivist and going through the archives is to read some of the criminal action papers that I shared with you, for an example, that are not indexed. They're not indexed because not many people read superscript anymore. And even with that, there's such a challenge to index terminology for the internet. And so there is a gigantic volume of resources that's basically untapped, that if you have the time to go and sit down with those papers and read through. And so fortunately, my tenure at the archives, I would spend hours, lunch breaks, things like that, weekends, going through criminal action papers, abstracting these types of information, going through court records, abstracting this type of information that even still is not indexed on the internet. It's a party waiting to happen.
Thank you all so much for your answers. We're coming along close to the end of our session. We had it for 7:15. We can have a few more moments, and I'd like to thank all of you for attending. I'd like to thank President Dillard for her attendance and for her support of the center. And before we close, we're going to turn it to Dean Valerie Ann Johnson, who has a closing statement from the passage of William Still. Dean Johnson.
Yes, thank you. So to tie this all together, and I want to thank our panelists so much for that rich overview of our history. This is just, I would say, part one, because there's so much to say. And I have gotten notes from folks, especially President Dillard, to bring you all back again to do some more follow-up, because I know you all have some other stories, believe me, and they're very interesting. But to connect us back to Sanctuary Road and why we thought that this would be a good conversation to have prior to this opera, which is about William Still's record, the records he kept of enslaved persons running away. I wanted to share with you what he said about North Carolina. And this is directly from William Still's account called book, The Underground Railroad Record. And as Earl has said, it is, when they transcribe the record, it is exactly as he wrote it. You will have to read through all of the accounts if you want to find your persons, because it's not indexed in a way that we could easily find in today's abilities. So to have an opera based on this work is going to be incredible. So here's what William Still said, and the title of the section of his record is called Blood Flowed Freely. Abram Galloway, this is for you, Earl. Abram Galloway and Richard Eden, two passengers secreted in a vessel loaded with spirits of turpentine, shrouds prepared to prevent being smoked to death. So he's describing the escaping of two figures, Abram Galloway, who is important to North Carolina history. And what William Still also writes is, quote, the Philadelphia branch of the Underground Railroad was not fortunate in having very frequent arrivals from North Carolina. Of course, such of her slave population as managed to become initiated in the mysteries of traveling north by the Underground Railroad were sensible enough to find out nearer and safer routes than through Pennsylvania. Nevertheless, the Vigilance Committee of Philadelphia occasionally had the pleasure of receiving some heroes who are worthy to be classed among the bravest of the brave, no matter who they be, who have claims to this distinction. And he goes on to talk about those figures like Galloway and Eden. The person who I found really interesting was William Jordan. I'll end with this. Under Governor Badger of North Carolina, William had experienced slavery in its most hateful form. True, he had only been 12 months under the yoke of this high functionary, but William's experience in this short space of time was of a nature very painful. And he goes on to talk about it, and he talks to him about what happened during the time and why is it that he left. And here's why he left enslavement. The governor decided that he would be separated from his wife by sale. She was sold 200 miles away. So because he couldn't see his wife, this is what William says. Against this cruel decision of the governor, William's heart revolted, for he was warmly attached to his wife, and so he made up his mind, if he could not see her once or twice a year even, as he had been promised, he had rather die or live in a cave in the wood than to remain all his life under the governor's yoke. Obeying the dictates of his feelings, he went to the woods for 10 months before he was successful in finding the Underground Railroad. This brave-hearted young fugitive abode in the swamps, 3 months in a cave, surrounded with bears, wildcats, rattlesnakes, and the like. And this is the accounting. This is how we know what happened. And so I am so thrilled that all of you joined us this evening and shared with us this time to learn about this history, these stories, this resilience. And I hope you all are encouraged to learn more and to be strong in the things that you feel strongly and passionately about. Dr. Moore, do you have one last word for us as we end?
Again, I want to thank our presenters. They did an excellent job tying this into this wonderful opera that I just can't wait to see about the Underground Railroad. I mean, when we think about opera, when we think about the world premiere that is happening here in our state, is really just an incredible event. And we really are so pleased to be able to tie the main topic of this opera with our true living history, and to thank, Mr. James and Ms. Thorpe. I mean, you all are just really bringing the whole story home. So we hope that you all will continue to learn about the Underground Railroad. We hope that you will spend some time visiting the sites that they spoke about, reading archives, reading more history. There's books on slave narratives out now. And of course, we want you to join us for the opera. It's going to be from March 4th through the 6th. Our HBC Unite is going to be on Saturday, March 5th. So please join us. Please learn more about the opera. And thank you all so much for your participation. And you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.